The thunder rumbled across the distant peaks as Katherine Rose clung to her shawl, the late October wind cutting through the threadbare fabric like a knife. The year was 1878, and Ouray, Colorado was no place for a woman alone, especially not one 5 months with child and nowhere to go. The door of her family's home had slammed behind her with such finality that the sound still echoed in her ears, even hours later as she huddled beneath the overhang of the general store. "You've brought shame to this family, Katherine." Her father had bellowed, his face twisted with rage as her mother sobbed in the corner. "William Davenport promised to marry you, gave you his word as a gentleman, and now he's halfway to California with our money and your virtue. I'll not have a fallen woman under my roof." Her protestations that William had sworn his love, had promised to return, fell on deaf ears. Even as she pleaded, she'd known the truth. William was gone, along with her father's investment in what had turned out to be a fraudulent mining venture. She was merely collateral damage. Katherine's hand instinctively moved to her swollen belly. The baby kicked as if sensing her distress, and she fought back tears. "We'll be all right," she whispered, though she had no idea how. "Miss, you can't spend the night there." The voice startled her, and Katherine looked up to see Sheriff Thomas peering down at her, concern etched across his weathered face. "I've nowhere else to go," she admitted, her voice small against the howl of the wind. "My family has cast me out." The sheriff sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his graying hair. "The Roses have always been a proud bunch, stubborn too." He replaced his hat, frowning. "There's a boarding house at the edge of town. Mrs. Peterson might take you in for a night or two, but after that—" "Thank you, Sheriff." Katherine gathered her single carpet bag, containing all she had been allowed to take: a change of clothes, a hairbrush, and her mother's Bible, slipped to her in a rare moment of maternal defiance. The sheriff escorted her to the boarding house, a 2-story clapboard structure with yellow light spilling from its windows. Mrs. Peterson, a thin woman with pinched features, looked Katherine up and down, her eyes lingering disapprovingly on her protruding belly. "I run a respectable establishment," she said coldly. "She needs shelter for the night, Florence," Sheriff Thomas said firmly. "Just one night." Mrs. Peterson's lips thinned further, but she nodded curtly. "1 night, 2 bits, and you're gone by noon tomorrow." Katherine paid from the meager coins in her purse and was shown to a small, drafty room at the end of the hall. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, allowing her tears to fall freely for the first time since her father had pointed toward the door. The baby kicked again, more insistently this time. "It's just us now," she murmured, stroking her belly. "But I promise you, little one, I will find a way." Dawn came too quickly, pale light filtering through the thin curtains. Katherine had barely slept, her mind racing with possibilities, none of them promising. She had cousins in Denver, but the journey would be perilous alone and with winter approaching. She had a modest talent for sewing. Perhaps she could find work, though few would hire an unmarried woman in her condition. She washed her face in the chipped basin, pinned her auburn hair as neatly as she could, and headed downstairs. Mrs. Peterson was waiting, arms crossed. "I've a bit of bread and coffee for you," she said, her tone slightly softer than the previous night. "Then you'll need to be on your way." Katherine thanked her, eating the stale bread and drinking the bitter coffee gratefully. She had just gathered her bag when the door to the boarding house burst open, letting in a gust of cold air and a tall, broad-shouldered man. "Morning, Mrs. Peterson," he said, removing his hat to reveal sandy hair and startlingly blue eyes. "Came to see if you've got a room available for a spell." "Mr. Sullivan," Mrs. Peterson's demeanor transformed, a smile replacing her pinched expression. "I certainly do. How long will you be staying in Ouray this time?" "Longer than usual," he replied, his gaze shifting to Katherine, who stood awkwardly by the stairs. "Bought the old Garrison place. Planning to settle down a bit." "Well, that is news," Mrs. Peterson tittered. "Jesse Sullivan putting down roots. I never thought I'd see the day." The man Jesse smiled, but his eyes remained on Katherine. "Madam," he acknowledged with a slight nod. Katherine nodded back, feeling heat rise to her cheeks under his scrutiny. She gathered her shawl more tightly around her shoulders, though it did little to hide her condition. "Miss Rose was just leaving," Mrs. Peterson said pointedly. She was only staying the one night. Jesse's eyebrows rose slightly. Rose, you one of Edward Rose's kin, his daughter, Katherine admitted reluctantly, knowing her father's reputation in town. Heading somewhere specific? Jesse asked, ignoring the way Mrs. Peterson was trying to usher him toward the guest register. Katherine swallowed hard. I haven't decided yet. Jesse studied her for a long moment, his gaze taking in her worn dress, the small carpet bag, and the unmistakable swell of her belly. Understanding dawned in his eyes. I see. Mrs. Peterson cleared her throat loudly. Mr. Sullivan, if you'll just sign here. Actually, Mrs. Peterson, Jesse interrupted, still looking at Katherine. I believe I'll need to delay that room. I've some business to attend to first. He turned to Katherine, his expression unreadable. Miss Rose, I'm heading over to the Garrison Place, my place now, I suppose. It's a fair walk, but if you've nowhere pressing to be, I could use some advice on what needs fixing up first. A woman's eye, if you will. Katherine stared at him, unsure of his intentions. His eyes held no judgment, only a quiet steadiness that somehow calmed the panic that had been building in her chest since yesterday. I don't know the first thing about homesteading, she admitted. Jesse shrugged, a half smile playing at his lips. Neither do I. Been driving cattle most my life. But I figure between us, we might come up with something. It was madness to consider going anywhere with a stranger, but Katherine found herself nodding. What choice did she have? The street or the unknown? At least the unknown offered a reprieve, however brief. Excellent, Jesse said, turning back to a stunned Mrs. Peterson. I'll be back for that room this evening. Good day to you. Outside, Katherine shivered in the morning chill. Jesse noticed and frowned. That shawl's not near warm enough, here. He shrugged out of his heavy coat and draped it over her shoulders before she could protest. Mr. Sullivan, I can't. Jesse, he corrected, and you can. I've got my vest and I run warm besides. He picked up her carpet bag. It's about a mile outside town. Can you manage the walk, or should I see about getting a wagon? I can walk, Katherine insisted, drawing his coat closer around her. It smelled of tobacco, leather, and something indefinably masculine. But Mr. Sullivan, Jesse, I don't understand why you're doing this. Jesse started walking, gesturing for her to follow. Let's just say I know what it's like to have nowhere to go. They walked in silence for a time, Katherine struggling to keep up with Jesse's long strides until he noticed and slowed his pace. The town gave way to scattered homesteads, and eventually they turned onto a narrow dirt path that led to a modest cabin nestled against a stand of pine trees. A barn and corral stood nearby, both in need of repair. It ain't much, Jesse acknowledged as they approached. Old man Garrison let it go some after his wife passed, but the bones are good. Katherine surveyed the property. The cabin's porch sagged on one side and several roof shingles were missing, but the walls looked solid and smoke curled invitingly from the stone chimney. You've been here already? She asked, surprised. Rode in yesterday, dropped off some supplies. Jesse climbed the porch steps carefully, testing each one as he went. He held out his hand to help her up, and Katherine took it, noticing the strength in his calloused grip. The cabin's interior was spare but clean. A fire crackled in the hearth, warming the single room. A bed stood in one corner, a table and 2 chairs in another, and a small cookstove along the far wall. Crates of provisions were stacked neatly by the door. Like I said, it ain't much, Jesse repeated, watching Katherine's face carefully. It's more than I have, she replied honestly. Jesse nodded, setting her carpet bag down by the door. Miss Rose, Katherine, she interrupted. If I'm to call you Jesse? Katherine, he amended with a small smile. I'll be direct. I know your situation or can guess most of it. The father of your child has abandoned you and your family has turned you out. Katherine's chin lifted defiantly. And you thought to take advantage of my desperation? Jesse's eyes widened and he actually took a step back. No, madam, that's not. I mean to offer you a proposition, but not of the kind you're thinking. Katherine's defiance faltered, replaced by confusion. What kind of proposition? Jesse gestured to the cabin around them. I need someone to look after this place while I'm working. I've taken on as foreman at the Brookfield Ranch, which means long days, sometimes weeks away when we're moving cattle. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. And you need a roof over your head, particularly with winter coming and a baby on the way. You're offering me a job. Katherine asked, incredulous. Room and board plus a small wage, Jesse confirmed. You'd keep house, maybe plant a garden come spring. I'm not much for cooking anything beyond beans and bacon, so decent meals would be welcome. Katherine's mind raced. It seemed too good to be true, and in her experience, such things usually were. Why would you do this for a complete stranger? Jesse's gaze dropped to her belly, then back to her face. His eyes held something Katherine couldn't quite read, a sorrow, perhaps, or a memory. That child needs a father who'll stay, he said quietly. But until you find one, you both need shelter and safety. I can provide that much at least. Katherine felt tears prick at her eyes, and she blinked them back. I don't know what to say. Say you'll consider it, Jesse replied. Stay here tonight. I'll bunk in the barn. Take some time to think it over. It was rash, possibly dangerous, and definitely improper. But as Katherine looked around the small cabin with its warm fire and solid walls, she felt the first stirrings of hope since William had left her with empty promises and a growing child. I'll consider it, she agreed softly. Jesse nodded, seeming pleased. Good. Now I need to get over to the ranch, meet with Mr. Brookfield. There's food in those crates, help yourself. I'll be back by nightfall. After Jesse left, Katherine explored the cabin more thoroughly. Despite its sparse furnishings, it was sturdy and could be made comfortable with a woman's touch. The bed had a fresh straw tick and clean, if worn, blankets. The cookstove was in good repair. There was even a small shelf with a few books, mostly practical guides to farming and animal husbandry, but also a volume of Tennyson's poems that looked well read. She unpacked her meager belongings, then set about preparing a simple meal from the provisions Jesse had left. By the time he returned, night was falling, and the aroma of beans simmered with salt pork and onions filled the cabin. Jesse stamped the dust from his boots before entering, his face lighting up at the smell. Now that's a welcome sight, he said appreciatively, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. They ate at the small table, conversation initially awkward but gradually easing as Jesse told her about the Brookfield Ranch and his plans for the Garrison place now. Mr. Brookfield's getting on in years, Jesse explained. His sons both moved east, no interest in ranching. He's looking to scale back, which is why he hired me on as foreman. Says in a few years, he might be willing to sell me a piece of his grazing land if things go well. You plan to start your own ranch? Katherine asked. Jesse nodded, sopping up the last of his beans with a piece of cornbread. Been working other men's cattle since I was 16. Figure it's time I worked my own. He glanced around the cabin. This place is just the start. It's a good start, Katherine offered. Jesse's eyes met hers, warm with something that might have been gratitude. What about you, Katherine? What were your plans before? Well, before things changed, Katherine's hand drifted to her belly. Nothing so ambitious. I was to marry William Davenport, help him run the mercantile he planned to open with my father's investment. She laughed bitterly. Turns out neither the mercantile nor the marriage were ever going to happen. William took the money and ran. Jesse's expression darkened. Men like that deserve a rope. Men like that rarely get what they deserve, Katherine replied wearily, but I can't dwell on it now. I have to think of the future, my child's future. Our arrangement could help with that, Jesse said carefully. It wouldn't be permanent, of course, just until you're back on your feet, able to make your own way if that's what you want. Katherine studied him across the table, this man who had offered her sanctuary when her own blood had cast her out. He was handsome in a rugged way, with laugh lines around his eyes despite the serious set of his mouth. His hands were work roughened but gentle in their movements. Most importantly, his eyes held no deceit that she could detect. Yes, she said finally. I accept your proposition, Mr. Sullivan. Jesse smiled, genuine and warm. Jesse, he reminded her, and I'm glad to hear it. That night, true to his word, Jesse slept in the barn despite Katherine's protests that it was too cold. I've slept in worse conditions, he assured her, and it would hardly be proper otherwise. Katherine lay in the bed that was now temporarily hers, listening to the wind whistling through the pine trees outside. For the first time since discovering her condition, she slept deeply and without fear. The next few weeks established a routine. Jesse would leave for the Brookfield Ranch before dawn, returning after dark. Katherine kept the cabin, prepared meals, and began making small improvements, hanging curtains fashioned from feed sacks, braiding a rug from old fabric scraps she found in a trunk, patching the worst leaks in the roof with Jesse's guidance. November brought the first heavy snow, turning the world outside white and hushed. Jesse spent more time at the cabin, repairing the barn and reinforcing the corral when the weather permitted. They began to learn each other's habits and preferences. Jesse liked his coffee strong. Katherine preferred to sleep with the window cracked even in cold weather. He had a habit of humming when he worked. She often talked to her unborn child when she thought no one was listening. They also learned each other's stories, shared in pieces over evening meals or while working side by side on cabin repairs. Jesse had left home at 16 after his mother died and his father turned to drink. He'd worked his way west, cowboying on ranches from Texas to Montana before deciding Colorado was where he wanted to put down roots. "What about family?" Katherine asked one evening as they sat by the fire. "Do you have siblings?" Jesse poked at the burning logs, sending sparks up the chimney. "A sister, Hannah. She married a shopkeeper in St. Louis. We write now and then." "Do they know you've settled here?" "Not yet," Jesse shrugged. "Wanted to make sure it would stick before I told them. Hannah's been after me for years to stop wandering." Katherine smiled, imagining this unknown woman's relief at hearing her brother had finally found a place to call home. "She'll be pleased then." "Expect so." Jesse glanced at her across the fire. "What about you? Besides your parents, do you have other family, a brother, James?" "He's in Denver working for the railroad." Katherine sighed. "We were close once, but he took after father in many ways, including his rigid sense of propriety. I doubt he'd welcome me any more than they did." Jesse frowned. "Family should stand by each other no matter what." "Should," Katherine agreed sadly, "but often don't." As December arrived, Katherine's condition became more pronounced. The baby was active, especially in the evenings, and she often caught Jesse watching with barely concealed curiosity when she would press a hand to her belly in response to a particularly strong kick. One snowy evening, after a simple supper of venison stew, Jesse had taken down a deer the week before Katherine gasped suddenly, her hand flying to her side. Jesse was on his feet instantly, alarm clear on his face. "What's wrong? Is it the baby?" Katherine couldn't help but laugh at his panic. "Nothing's wrong. The baby's just being particularly enthusiastic tonight." Without thinking, she reached for his hand. "Here, feel." She placed his large hand on the side of her belly, holding it there until the baby kicked again. Jesse's eyes widened in wonder and a slow smile spread across his face. "Strong little thing," he murmured. "Like its mother," Katherine replied, then blushed at her own boldness. Jesse didn't remove his hand immediately, and Katherine didn't ask him to. They stayed like that for a moment, connected by the life growing beneath their joined hands until the baby settled and the spell was broken. Jesse withdrew, clearing his throat. "I should check on the horses before turning in." He donned his coat and hat and disappeared into the snowy night, leaving Katherine to wonder at the strange fluttering in her chest that had nothing to do with the baby. As Christmas approached, the weather turned brutal. Blizzards swept down from the mountains, sometimes keeping Jesse at the ranch for days at a time. During one such storm, Katherine found herself alone in the cabin for nearly a week, rationing firewood and provisions, trying not to worry about Jesse's safety. When he finally returned, half frozen and exhausted, Katherine felt a surge of emotion so strong it frightened her. She helped him remove his ice-crusted coat and boots, sat him by the fire and pressed a mug of hot coffee into his hands, all while fighting the urge to throw her arms around him in relief. "I was worried," she admitted, sitting across from him. Jesse's eyes, tired as they were, warmed at her words. "Were you now?" Katherine nodded, not trusting herself to speak further. "I would have been back sooner, but the creek flooded, then froze, had to take the long way around." He sipped his coffee, sighing appreciatively. "How have you been managing?" "Well enough," she assured him. "The baby and I have been keeping each other company." Jesse studied her over the rim of his mug. "You're looking tired. Been sleeping all right." The truth was, she hadn't. The baby's position had become increasingly uncomfortable, and nightmares about giving birth alone in the cabin during a blizzard had plagued her. But she merely shrugged. As well as can be expected, Jesse didn't look convinced. You should have the doctor out. Make sure everything's progressing as it should. Doctors cost money, Katherine reminded him gently, and I'm sure everything is fine. I can afford it, Jesse insisted. And we should know for certain. The baby's due soon, isn't it? February, I think. Katherine was touched by his concern, by the "we" that had slipped so naturally from his lips. True to his word, Jesse rode into town the next day and returned with Dr. Harris, a gruff older man with kind eyes and gentle hands. He examined Katherine with professional detachment, pronouncing both mother and child to be in good health. The baby's positioned well, he told them as he packed his bag. Strong heartbeat. I'd say you've about 6 weeks to go, Mrs. Sullivan. Katherine froze, her eyes flying to Jesse, who looked equally startled. It's Miss Rose, actually, she corrected quickly. Mr. Sullivan is a friend. He's kindly allowing me to stay here until after the baby comes. Dr. Harris's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. I see, he said, in a tone that suggested he saw all too clearly and disapproved entirely. Well, Miss Rose, you should be prepared for the birth. First babies often come early. After the doctor left, an awkward silence fell between Katherine and Jesse. Finally, Jesse spoke, his voice carefully neutral. Folks are going to talk. They already are, I'm sure, Katherine replied, resigned. It's hardly the first time. Jesse paced the small cabin, running a hand through his hair. It's not right. You being judged, while the man who actually wronged you faces no consequences. That's the way of the world, Katherine said wearily. Women bear the burden of men's actions in more ways than one. She gestured to her swollen belly. Jesse stopped pacing, his expression resolute. It doesn't have to be that way. What do you mean, marry me, Jesse said, the words tumbling out as if he hadn't meant to say them aloud. Katherine stared at him, certain she'd misheard. What did you say? Jesse squared his shoulders, looking suddenly nervous but determined. Marry me, Katherine. Let me give your child my name, a father who'll stay. Jesse, you can't. I can, he interrupted. And I want to, not just for the child, but for you too. Katherine shook her head, bewildered. But we've only known each other a few weeks. And I'm carrying another man's child. I don't care about that, Jesse insisted. I care about you, both of you, these past weeks. He faltered, searching for words. I never thought I'd want to settle down, not really. Always figured I'd keep moving like I've done my whole life. But then you came along, and suddenly this cabin feels like more than just 4 walls and a roof. It feels like it could be a home. Katherine's heart pounded against her ribs. Are you saying? I'm saying I'm falling in love with you, Katherine Rose, Jesse admitted, his voice low and earnest. And I want to be a father to your child if you'll let me. Tears sprang to Katherine's eyes. Jesse, you don't have to answer now, he said quickly. Take some time to think about it. It's a big decision. Katherine nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Jesse took his hat from its peg, murmuring something about checking the animals, and left her alone with her tumultuous thoughts. That night, Katherine lay awake long after the cabin had grown silent, Jesse having returned to his pallet by the fire rather than sleeping in the barn due to the bitter cold. His proposal replayed in her mind, along with all the moments that had led to it, his kindness when she had nothing, his respect for her boundaries, his growing excitement about the baby. Was it possible to fall in love so quickly after being so thoroughly betrayed? And yet, as she compared Jesse to William in her mind, she realized there was no comparison at all. William had been all charm and promises, while Jesse was steadiness and action. William had fled at the first sign of responsibility. Jesse had opened his home to it. And somewhere along the way, amid shared meals and quiet evenings, working side by side to make the cabin weathertight and comfortable, she had begun to look forward to Jesse's return each day, to feel safer in his presence, to imagine a future where they were truly a family. I think I'm falling in love with him, she whispered to her unborn child, the admission both terrifying and freeing. The baby kicked in response, as if in agreement. Christmas Eve arrived with clear skies and bitter cold. Jesse returned from the ranch early. carrying a small pine tree he'd cut on the way home. Together, they set it up in a corner of the cabin and decorated it with strings of dried berries, paper stars Katherine had cut from old newspaper, and a single glass ornament Jesse had purchased in town, a delicate angel that caught the firelight and scattered it around the room. "It's beautiful," Katherine said softly as they admired their handiwork. "It needed a proper Christmas," Jesse replied, watching her rather than the tree. "Both of you did." Later, after a simple Christmas Eve supper, Jesse presented Katherine with a small package wrapped in brown paper and twine. "It's not much," he said, suddenly shy, "but I wanted you to have something." Katherine unwrapped it carefully to reveal a lovely carved wooden box with a hinged lid. Inside, nestled in a scrap of velvet, was a silver locket on a delicate chain. "Jesse," she breathed, lifting it to catch the light. "It's exquisite. Open it," he urged. Inside the locket was a tiny, perfectly rendered sketch of the cabin with the mountains rising behind it. "I had Mrs. Brookfield draw it," Jesse explained. "She has quite a talent, I thought. No matter what you decide about my proposal, you should have something to remember your time here." Katherine closed the locket gently, then reached for Jesse's hand. "I've made my decision," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Yes, Jesse Sullivan, I will marry you." The joy that spread across Jesse's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Katherine nodded, feeling more certain with each passing moment. "I'm sure. You've shown me what a good man truly is, Jesse. And I believe you'll be a wonderful father to this child." Jesse raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of your trust, Katherine." "I know you will," she replied, believing it with her whole heart. They were married 2 days after Christmas by the circuit preacher who had arrived in Ouray for the holiday. The ceremony was small, just the two of them, Dr. Harris and his wife as witnesses, and the preacher but filled with genuine emotion. Katherine wore her best dress, altered to accommodate her condition, and Jesse wore a clean shirt and his Sunday boots polished to a shine. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Jesse kissed her for the first time tenderly, reverently, a promise in the touch of his lips against hers. Word of their marriage spread quickly through town, eliciting various reactions. Some, like Mrs. Peterson at the boarding house, sniffed disapprovingly at the hasty wedding and Katherine's obvious condition. Others, who knew Jesse's character, offered congratulations and well wishes. Katherine's family remained silent, though she had sent word of her marriage to her parents' home. January brought more snow and increasingly uncomfortable days for Katherine as the baby grew heavier. Jesse fretted over her, insisting she rest more and taking on additional household chores despite his long days at the ranch. "You're working yourself too hard," Katherine protested one evening as Jesse prepared supper, having insisted she stay off her swollen feet. "I'm fine," he assured her, stirring a pot of stew. "I've been looking after myself for years. Besides, you're doing the hard work." He nodded toward her belly. Katherine smiled, touched by his concern. "Still, you shouldn't have to come home after a long day and cook your own supper." "Our supper," Jesse corrected, coming to sit beside her while the stew simmered. "And I don't mind. Truth is, I like taking care of you, Katherine." The warmth in his blue eyes made her breath catch. Since their wedding, Jesse had been the perfect gentleman, still sleeping on his pallet by the fire rather than joining her in the bed that was now rightfully theirs to share. His kisses had remained chaste, his touches careful, as if he feared she might change her mind about their arrangement. But Katherine had discovered that her feelings for Jesse had only grown stronger since becoming his wife. She found herself watching him as he worked, admiring the play of muscles beneath his shirt, the grace with which he moved despite his size. She wondered what it would be like to truly be his wife in all ways once the baby was born and her body was her own again. As if reading her thoughts, Jesse reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "You're so beautiful," he murmured. Katherine laughed self-consciously. "I'm as big as a house." "Beautiful," Jesse repeated firmly. He hesitated, then said, "Katherine, I want you to know that I don't expect. That is, I understand if you never want." Katherine placed her fingers against his lips, silencing him. Jesse Sullivan, are you trying to tell me you don't expect me to be a proper wife to you? Jesse's cheeks reddened slightly. I just want you to know there's no pressure. Our marriage can be whatever you want it to be, and if I want it to be real in every way. Katherine asked softly, summoning her courage. If I want you as my husband truly and completely once the baby comes, Jesse's eyes darkened with unmistakable desire, but his voice remained gentle. Then I would be the happiest man in Colorado territory. Katherine leaned forward, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that held promise and heat. Good, she whispered against his mouth, because that's exactly what I want. The stew nearly boiled over, forcing Jesse to return to the stove. But the look he gave Katherine over his shoulder told her their conversation was far from finished. February arrived with a thaw that turned the snow to slush and made the roads nearly impassable. Katherine grew increasingly restless, her back aching constantly, her nights broken by the baby's movements and her own discomfort. Jesse hovered anxiously, torn between his responsibilities at the ranch and his concern for Katherine. I should stay home, he fretted one morning as a light rain fell, promising to turn the already muddy roads to quagmires. What if the baby comes while I'm gone? Dr. Harris said first babies rarely come early, Katherine reminded him, though privately she wondered. The pressure in her lower back had intensified overnight, and she'd felt strange cramps that came and went throughout the early morning hours. Still, Jesse hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave. Go, Katherine insisted. Mr. Brookfield is counting on you. I promise to send word if anything changes. Jesse finally agreed, but not before extracting a promise that she would rest and asking Mrs. Brookfield to check on her in the afternoon. He kissed her goodbye, his hand lingering on her belly for a moment before mounting his horse and heading out into the drizzle. Katherine busied herself with small tasks, trying to ignore the increasing frequency of the cramps. By midday, however, she could no longer deny that something was happening. When a sharp pain doubled her over as she stood at the stove, forcing a gasp from her lips, she knew the baby was coming weeks earlier than expected. Fear gripped her. Jesse was miles away at the ranch. The nearest neighbor was a good half-hour walk in good weather, and the rain had turned to sleet, making the path treacherous. Dr. Harris was in town, an hour's ride even if she could somehow get word to him. Another pain seized her, stronger than the last, and Katherine gripped the edge of the table, breathing through it as her mother had once described. When it passed, she moved purposefully through the cabin, gathering what she would need: clean cloths, a basin of water, the knife Jesse kept razor sharp for cleaning games, string for the cord. She built up the fire, knowing she would need warmth, then arranged the bed as best she could with shaking hands. Another pain came, forcing her to her knees beside the bed, and she knew with certainty that the baby would not wait for help to arrive. Just you and me, little one, she murmured, stroking her belly. We can do this. The hours that followed were a blur of pain and determination. Katherine drew on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed, guided by instinct and fragments of knowledge gleaned from overheard conversations among married women. The baby, it seemed, was equally determined, and as the afternoon light began to fade, Katherine felt the unmistakable urge to push. Outside, the sleet had turned back to snow, falling heavily now, muffling all sound. Inside the cabin, Katherine's cries echoed off the wooden walls as she bore down, bringing her child into the world through sheer will and fierce maternal love. And then, suddenly, it was over. A tiny, indignant wail filled the cabin as Katherine lifted her son, for it was a boy, onto her chest, wrapping him in a clean cloth with trembling hands. "Hello, my love," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she counted fingers and toes, marveling at his perfect miniature features. "You're so beautiful," the baby quieted at the sound of her voice, his unfocused eyes seeming to search for her face. Katherine felt a surge of love so powerful it took her breath away. She had done it, brought this precious life safely into the world, alone but unafraid. She was still marveling at this miracle when the cabin door burst open, admitting a flurry of snow and a wild-eyed Jesse. "Katherine," He rushed to her side, taking in the scene with a mixture of relief and awe. "The baby is here," she finished, her voice weak but triumphant. "Come meet your son, Jesse." Jesse knelt beside the bed, his expression transforming as he gazed at the tiny bundle in Catherine's arms. "A boy," he breathed, reaching out a tentative finger to touch the baby's cheek. "He's perfect. How did you know?" Catherine asked, suddenly realizing Jesse must have ridden through the snowstorm to reach them. "I didn't," Jesse admitted, his eyes never leaving the baby's face. "I just had a feeling I needed to get home, Mrs. Brookfield came by the north pasture where I was working, said she'd tried to check on you but couldn't get through because of the weather. I left right then." He finally looked up at Catherine, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here." "You're here now," Catherine said, leaning into the arm he slipped around her shoulders. "That's what matters." Jesse pressed a kiss to her forehead, then to the baby's downy head. "What shall we call him?" Catherine had been thinking about names for months but had settled on none. Now, looking at her son's peaceful face as he slept against her chest, she knew. "Jacob," she said softly. "Jacob Jesse Sullivan." Jesse's breath caught audibly. "You want to give him my name? He should bear the name of the man who chose to be his father," Catherine replied simply. "The man who will stay." Jesse gathered them both gently in his arms, his tears finally spilling over. "I will," he vowed, "always." The following days were a whirlwind of adjustment and wonder. Dr. Harris made it through the snow to check on mother and baby as soon as the storm abated, pronouncing both healthy despite the early arrival and difficult circumstances. Jesse took time away from the ranch to be with his new family, learning alongside Catherine how to care for tiny Jacob, how to swaddle him tightly, the different cries that signaled hunger or discomfort, the simple joy of holding him as he slept. Catherine watched Jesse with their son for truly, in every way that mattered, Jacob was theirs and felt her heart expand with each tender interaction. Jesse's large, work-roughened hands were impossibly gentle with the baby, his deep voice softening to a soothing rumble when Jacob fussed. One evening, as Jesse sat by the fire with Jacob cradled against his chest, Catherine was struck by how natural they looked together, as if they had always been meant to be father and son. "He has your eyes," Jesse said suddenly, looking up at Catherine with a smile. "Same shape, same expression when he's thinking hard about something." Catherine laughed softly, coming to perch on the arm of his chair. "And how would you know when a week-old baby is thinking hard about something?" "He gets this little furrow right here," Jesse demonstrated between his own eyebrows. "Just like you do when you're concentrating on your sewing or trying to decide if the stew needs more salt." Catherine touched the spot on her own forehead, surprised. "I had no idea I did that." "I notice everything about you," Jesse admitted quietly. "Have from the first day." The heat in his gaze made Catherine's pulse quicken. She had been healing well, regaining her strength more quickly than expected according to Dr. Harris. And with each passing day, her awareness of Jesse as a man her husband had grown more acute. "Jesse," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up at her, his expression open and warm. "I think it's time you moved your things from beside the fire," she said, gathering her courage. "To our bed." Jesse's eyes widened slightly. "Catherine, are you sure? It's only been a week since Jacob was born." Dr. Harris said to wait until I felt ready for certain activities," Catherine interrupted, a blush heating her cheeks. "But he didn't say anything about you simply sleeping beside me." "I miss you at night, Jesse. I want to fall asleep in your arms." Jesse's expression softened. "I miss you too," he admitted. "Feels wrong, being in the same cabin but so far apart." That night, after Jacob had been fed and settled in the cradle Jesse had crafted for him, they lay together in the bed that had been Catherine's alone for too long. Jesse's body was warm and solid against hers as he curled protectively around her, his arm a comfortable weight across her waist. "Is this all right?" he murmured against her hair. Catherine turned in his embrace to face him, her hand coming up to trace the line of his jaw. "It's perfect," she whispered, leaning in to press a soft kiss to his lips. Jesse returned the kiss gently, clearly mindful of her recent ordeal, but Catherine could feel the restraint in his touch. She deepened the kiss slightly, her hand sliding to the nape of his neck, and was rewarded with a soft groan from her husband. "Katherine," he warned, pulling back slightly, "we should stop." "Not entirely," she replied, resting her forehead against his. "Just go slowly." "I want to be close to you, Jesse." In the dim light of the banked fire, Jesse's eyes searched hers, finding only certainty. "I can go slowly," he promised, his voice rough with desire. They explored each other carefully that night, learning the contours and textures of each other's bodies with gentle touches and whispered words of appreciation. Jesse was achingly tender, treating Katherine as if she were made of the finest porcelain, and she reveled in his attentiveness. When they finally came together fully weeks later, it was with a sense of rightness and completion that brought tears to Katherine's eyes. This was what love was meant to be. She realized not the fleeting passion William had offered, but this steady, growing devotion that encompassed body and soul. "I love you, Katherine Sullivan," Jesse whispered in the darkness as they lay entwined, his heartbeat strong and sure beneath her cheek. "And I love you," she replied, the words feeling like coming home. Spring arrived in a riot of wildflowers and new beginnings. The cabin transformed under Katherine's care, becoming truly a home with curtains at the windows, a braided rug on the floor, and Jacob's cradle beside their bed. Jesse had proven himself not just at the Brookfield Ranch, where Mr. Brookfield was already talking about selling him a parcel of land, but as a husband and father who returned each evening eager to see his family. Jacob thrived, growing plump on his mother's milk, his dark hair and expressive eyes so like Katherine's drawing comments whenever they took him to town. If anyone remembered or cared that he had been born mere weeks after Katherine and Jesse's wedding, they kept such thoughts to themselves. To all appearances, the Sullivans were simply a young family starting out, no different from any other. In late April, as Katherine sat on the porch with Jacob in her arms, watching Jesse repair the fence around what would soon be her kitchen garden, a wagon appeared on the road leading to their cabin. Katherine shaded her eyes against the afternoon sun, trying to make out the occupants. "Jesse," she called, suddenly recognizing the driver. "It's my father." Jesse straightened immediately, setting down his tools and coming to stand beside her on the porch, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder as the wagon drew to a halt in their yard. Edward Rose sat rigid on the wagon seat, his face unreadable. Beside him was Katherine's mother, Margaret, who appeared to have been crying. Neither spoke as they regarded the tableau before them, their daughter with a baby in her arms, a tall cowboy standing sentinel beside her. "Father," Katherine acknowledged, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Mother, this is a surprise." Edward cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "Katherine, that is your mother, wish to see the child." Margaret Rose couldn't contain herself any longer. She climbed down from the wagon without assistance, her eyes fixed on the bundle in Katherine's arms. "Is that my grandson?" she asked, her voice quavering. Katherine nodded, unconsciously holding Jacob a bit tighter. "Yes, this is Jacob Jesse Sullivan." Margaret approached cautiously, as if afraid Katherine might turn her away, a fear not entirely unfounded, given their last parting. But Katherine had discovered that motherhood had softened some of her harder edges, allowing room for understanding if not yet forgiveness. "Would you like to hold him?" she offered, Margaret's face crumpled with relief and joy. "Oh yes, please." As Katherine carefully transferred Jacob to his grandmother's arms, she felt Jesse's hand squeeze her shoulder in silent support. Edward had remained on the wagon, watching the scene with an unreadable expression. "He's beautiful, Katherine," Margaret whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks as she gazed at her grandson. "So perfect." "Yes, he is," Jesse agreed, speaking for the first time, "takes after his mother." Edward finally descended from the wagon, approaching with measured steps. "You must be Sullivan," he said, eyeing Jesse critically. "Jesse Sullivan, sir, Katherine's husband." Jesse extended his hand, meeting Edward's gaze steadily. After a moment's hesitation, Edward shook it. "You married my daughter knowing the child wasn't yours." "I married Katherine knowing I wanted to be her husband and Jacob's father," Jesse corrected firmly. "That's all that matters to me." Edward's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I see." An uncomfortable silence fell, broken only by Jacob's soft coos as Margaret rocked him. Finally, Katherine stepped forward. "Would you like to come inside? I've just made coffee." The invitation, simple as it was, represented a potential bridge across the chasm that had opened between Katherine and her family. She wasn't ready to forget the hurt they had caused, the way they had abandoned her when she needed them most. But perhaps, for Jacob's sake, they could begin to build something new. Edward looked around at the neatly kept yard, the solid cabin with smoke curling from its chimney, the vegetable garden taking shape behind the fence Jesse had been repairing. "You've done well for yourselves," he acknowledged grudgingly. "We have," Jesse agreed, slipping an arm around Katherine's waist. "Very well indeed." Inside the cabin, over coffee and the bread Katherine had baked that morning, tentative conversation began. Edward and Margaret learned about Jesse's position at the Brookfield Ranch, his plans to acquire land of his own. Katherine heard news of her brother James, who had been promoted within the railroad company, and of changes in Ouray since she'd left. No direct apologies were offered, no explicit acknowledgement of past wrongs, but when Margaret asked hesitantly if they might visit again to see Jacob, Katherine found herself nodding. "He should know his grandparents," she said, glancing at Jesse, who nodded his agreement. "All of his family." As the Roses prepared to leave, Edward pulled Jesse aside while Katherine and her mother said their goodbyes to Jacob. "You're a better man than I gave you credit for, Sullivan," he said gruffly. "Taking on another man's child, giving him your name." "Jacob is my son in every way that matters," Jesse replied simply. "And Katherine is the best thing that ever happened to me. I'd be a fool not to recognize that." Edward studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Take care of them. Always," Jesse promised. After the wagon had disappeared down the road, Katherine and Jesse stood on the porch, Jacob sleeping peacefully in his father's arms. The setting sun painted the mountains gold and rose, a fitting end to a day of unexpected beginnings. "Are you all right?" Jesse asked, his free arm pulling Katherine close against his side. "I think so," she replied thoughtfully. "It wasn't what I expected, but it's a start." Jesse pressed a kiss to her temple. "That's how all good things begin, isn't it? With a start." Katherine smiled, remembering that cold October day when Jesse had offered her shelter and hope when she'd had neither. "Yes," she agreed, stretching up to kiss him properly. "The very best things." 5 years later, the Garrison place was nearly unrecognizable. The cabin had been expanded to include 2 proper bedrooms and a larger kitchen. The barn was new, built to house not just Jesse's horses, but the small herd of cattle that now grazed on land he'd purchased from Mr. Brookfield upon the older man's retirement. A white picket fence enclosed a thriving vegetable garden and protected Katherine's prized rose bushes from the curiosity of their chickens. On the porch swing, Katherine sat with 3-year-old Elizabeth Sullivan on her lap, the little girl's blonde curls so like her father's hair catching the summer sunlight. Inside, she could hear Jesse and Jacob engaged in an animated discussion about the new colt that had been born the previous week. "Mama, story," Elizabeth requested, her blue eyes also Jesse's looking up expectantly. "Which one would you like to hear, sweetheart?" Katherine asked, though she already knew the answer. It was always the same story her daughter wanted, the one Jesse had first told Jacob and now told both children at bedtime whenever they asked. "The one about the lady and the cowboy," Elizabeth replied predictably. Katherine smiled, shifting her daughter to a more comfortable position. "Once upon a time, there was a brave lady who found herself alone and in trouble. She had no home and no one to help her, until one day she met a kind cowboy who said that child needs a father who'll stay. And stay he did, becoming the best husband and father anyone could ask for. And they lived happy ever after," Elizabeth prompted. "Yes, my love," Katherine confirmed, her gaze drifting to the doorway where Jesse now stood, Jacob at his side, both watching her with identical expressions of adoration. "They most certainly did." Jesse crossed the porch to join them on the swing, lifting Elizabeth onto his lap while Jacob clambered up beside Katherine. As the swing rocked gently, the Sullivan family watched the sun set over the mountains that had witnessed their beginning. Happy. Jesse murmured, his hand finding Catherine's between them. Catherine squeezed his fingers, looking around at the home and family they had built together from the most unlikely of starts. Completely, she replied, knowing it was nothing less than the truth. And as night fell over the Colorado mountains, stars appearing one by one in the deepening blue, the light from the Sullivan cabin shone like a beacon, a testament to love found, promises kept, and a future still unfolding, one day at a time.